LeBron slide for the person in the balcony who yelled out LeBron earlier. Vainglory can have prideful roots, and this is a case in which what you're showing off is some glorious superiority or goodness that you think you have. Okay, so you deserve glory because you are all that. And there's lots of different versions of this: breakaway dunks, glory stories, bragging rights, academic verbosity, pompous titles. You name it, right? We can all play this game. And here's a case in which it's your glorious superiority that's on display. It's not that you're trying to hide something or cover it up. It's rather that you think you have a lot of goodness to share with the world, a lot to show off, a lot to display. So here's a couple other examples of ways that pride and vainglory get tangled together. And you can see how these two ended up being collapsed on the list because they're very similar, sort of having a lot of goodness to show, and then the showing off of the goodness. So the superiority side, the being superior, is the prideful side, and then the showing it off is the vainglory side. You can have one without the other. So you can imagine a form of pride where you're so sure of your own superiority that other people's opinion doesn't even matter. It's just beneath you to care. Right? That would be pride without vainglory. But most of the time, we're doing both at the same time. We're thinking we're pretty awesome, and we're making sure other people notice. Okay? Here's another familiar example from the Polar Express. Does everyone know that I know it all? It's not enough to be smart and know more facts about trains than everybody else and be really interested in trains. We have to spout facts about trains constantly to other annoyed people. And then another familiar example from Disney, the evil queen in Snow White. Again, the trope of the mirror, usually a tip-off that vainglory is in the neighborhood. And this is actually an interesting example because it combines pride, vainglory, and envy. It's like 3 strikes and you're out. That's the reason she's wearing black. She's evil. So her problem is this. She thinks she's the fairest of them all. She needs the mirror to affirm this about her, and she measures her worth in comparative terms. All right, so what she wants is to be fairer than Snow White, and if Snow White turns out to be fair, she's going to take her out. That's envy, right? Her sense of her superiority, I deserve to be fairer, I deserve to be the one who's on the top of the pile. That's pride. And then I need everybody to acknowledge it, starting with the mirror. All right, tell me I'm the fairest of them all. That's the vainglory part. So you can mix and match these vices in all sorts of interesting forms. Of course, vainglory can also completely pull apart from pride. And this is the kind of empty glory seeking where you just want to be popular. You just want to be attention getting. And it doesn't matter whether you think you're the best or not. I mean, what are the popular people popular for anyway? It's not even clear that there's any relevant sort of goodness involved, nor that they care about it, right? They just want to be the popular people. Right? It's really just all about getting the right kind of attention. And that's a case in which it's gotten detached from pride, all right, in a different kind of way. Now, one example that I want to talk to you about is a professor of television studies that Jake Halpern describes in his book, Fame Junkies. And it's an instructive example because I think it's the temptation of vainglory. Most of us, if we're rightly morally formed to some extent or other, actually care about the goodness we do have. And vainglory starts there. It starts with actually caring about the goodness and not caring about whether it's known. So, and then we get a kind of degenerative process that goes from there. And Jake Halpern's professor illustrates this. He starts out by doing some really good scholarship on the history of television and the way that television celebrities make a name for themselves. And it's the integrity of his research that starts getting some recognition. And so reporters show up and they interview him for stories about this or stories about that. And, you know, he interviews pretty well and he thinks, this is great. I have a chance to kind of expand my classroom and teach more people and it's all good. It's eerily similar to what I'm doing tonight, which the story always kind of makes me worry. But as he gets interviewed more and more, the university gives him a nicer office so that, you know, the university will get some good show and good PR out of the interview process, and they give him a dressing room so he can, spiff up before the interviews. And he gets more and more used to the reporters coming. And what happens is that you get a little seduced by the fame side of things and a little bit less interested and attached to the integrity of the research that got you the attention in the first place, right? And as these things pull further and further apart, the professor ends up with a confession like the one you see on the slide. So he says at the end of this section of the book, the professor seems most aware of his own craving for attention. In those dry periods when no news organizations are calling, I haven't had a TV interview since the 17th of March, the professor reported. And since then, there have been moments when I've gotten worried that my career is over. Of course, I'm being a little hyperbolic, but this stuff is a little bit like heroin. I guess once you get used to a certain degree of attention, you need more. And then you build up a tolerance, and I think there's no end to where the spiral can go. But the 17th of March was only 2 weeks ago, Jake Halpern tells him. No, replies the professor gravely. If it were only 2 weeks ago, I wouldn't be worried. It was 3 weeks ago. Right? And you see what's happened there. You started out with a noble cause, something that was worthy of attention, the attention you were getting for it, and gradually you get this kind of degenerative slide into the attention seeking now has the focus. That's what has the grip on your heart. And that's the worry with vainglory. Not that most of us are sort of shallow celebrity seekers, but rather that when we do get attention for the good things that we do have, this is the pull away from the good that all of us are liable to experience at some point or other. Now, the other root of vainglory that I want to talk about, and this is one that I'm sort of supplementing from the tradition, they focus on the kind of arrogant, boastful, I'm all that form of pride. And I want to talk about fear as a root of vainglory. Think about this. When do you need to be most concerned with your appearance and how you come off to others? When you're really confident in your own goodness and your own beauty and attractive power? No. When do you spend the most time in front of the mirror? When you're worried that you're not going to measure up, when you're worried that people are going to see through you, when you're worried that they're going to notice a flaw or that they're going to criticize something defective. And so what the fearful form of vainglory exposes is that we are liable to hypocrisy and false fronts and cover-ups and disguises, most when we fear that other people won't see goodness in us, and therefore we have to sort of put on a mask or a nice cover so that we will get the right kinds of attention, even if we don't have the goods that will back it up. And we know that about ourselves. I mean, the cosmetic industry would be nowhere without preying on people's view of themselves as somehow deficient in appearance. So the Dove Campaign for Real Beauty is an example of the way in which we Photoshop and color wand ourselves and make up ourselves into a picture of acceptable beauty for the world to applaud and appreciate, right? As if we wouldn't get it without that. And then, just so you guys don't get off the hook, let's do a little 4th century locker room talk with St. Augustine here. The temptation here for Augustine is peer pressure. It's wanting to be accepted by the guys, and what are the guys going to accept him for? Well, it's not physical beauty that's the issue here. It's your past reputation, what you've been doing with the ladies. Let's hear about it, Augustine. And so this is what he says. Among my friends, I was ashamed to be less shameless than they were when I heard them boasting of their disgraceful exploits. Yes, and glorying all the more, the worse their baseness was. That's notorious vainglorious, folks. What is worse, I took pleasure in such exploits, not for the pleasure, but mostly for the praise I'd get from my friends. And when in anything I had not sinned as much as the worst ones in the group, I would still say that I had done what I had not done in order not to appear contemptible because I was more innocent than they. I mean, this is a game we play. This is what we do. You lived this in middle school, admit it, right? This is how you survive in 7th grade, right? You brag about stuff you haven't done in order to get accepted by your friends. And look at Augustine. He's still doing it when he hits his career as a professional rhetorician later in his life, and he's in his 20s. And he says this about another orator that he aspires to be like. And notice what he loves about this guy. That orator, Hieros, was of the type which I so loved that I wanted to be like him. Why? Because he's such a great orator and you aspire to be one too? Well, not really. How do I know that my love for him was aroused by the regard of those praising him rather than by the actual achievements which evoked their praise? Well, it was important to me whether my discourse and my studies were being known to this guy. If they met with his approbation, his approval, I would have been really excited. But if he had disapproved of my work, my heart being vain would have been hurt. I'm not interested necessarily in excellence as an orator. I just want to be famous like him. Look at the applause he's getting from people, right? I'm interested in the goodness he has only insofar as it's getting him the feedback, the praise, the approval, all right? That's a way to aspire to greatness in a career that has vainglory written all over it. And the worry with fearful vainglory is that we never actually get to know anybody and therefore are unable to love them. And likewise, no one is able to get to know who we are, who we really are, and therefore no one is able to love us for who we really are. I mean, think about the problem here. What is glory all about? It's about being affirmed for the goodness that you have. It's about being loved and appreciated and recognized for the goodness of who you are. Right? It's a kind of Isaiah 43 kind of affirmation. I know you by name. I know you inside and out, and I love you. You're mine. You're in. You're good. You're affirmed. But instead of hearing that truthfully from God with respect to our true self, we try to manufacture a false self that's socially acceptable, and we try to get all the affirmation we can from a human audience as if that's going to be enough. And look at the undermining enterprise that turns out to be. You get the affirmation. What do you get it for? For the false front. So you're going to have to keep people out. You're going to have to keep people at bay. You're going to have to keep people deceived about who you really are in order to be loved. Well, that's an empty game. You are going nowhere with that program. You'll never get the fulfillment you're longing for. It's a self-undermining enterprise. What we really long for is people who know us face to face, wrinkles and all, who love us for just the way we are, and who affirm us as such. We don't have to put on a show. We don't have to be something other than we're not. And ultimately, we get this from God. Imperfect human beings can only do so much. We need this from other people as the voices and hands of God in our lives. But ultimately, human beings cannot fill us up with their affirmation. Ultimately, we have to go to the source. If we really long for relationship that's truthful, that's loving, that's affirming and honest all at the same time, then vainglory is a game that we're going to have to give up. Now, my students and I came up with a little voice quiz based on, you guessed it, episodes in the life of St. Augustine. So read Augustine's Confessions over again with vainglory in mind. All right, and ask yourself, have you ever exaggerated something you've done or made up something about yourself in order to impress people who are listening? Have you ever said something false or bad about another person in order to get your friends to think you're funny and entertaining? Have you ever spent time trying to receive recognition or approval for the car you drove, the job you have, the music you listen to, the neighborhood or house you live in, the way you dress or do your hair? Have you ever done something wrong, illegal, or foolish because you wanted attention from a certain group of people? And then, on the goody two-shoes side, have you ever spent too much time worrying about a task or performance because you were too concerned about whether others would approve, whether you would measure up? That's the fearful side again. So this is obviously not a perfect test, but it is gives you at least a sense for the ways in which vainglory showed up in the life of St. Augustine, the way it shows up in our lives. These are, I think, the kinds of practices that all of us are tempted by to one extent or another. Now that you all feel appropriately guilty and convicted of vainglory, and I with you, we need to talk about what to do about it. And I suggest that we learn from the dead. It's always a cheerful way to begin the remedy section. I have my students go out into the cemetery at the beginning of the ethics class that I teach. And Abba Macarius, the Egyptian, is one of the Desert Fathers, and he has this advice on how to go about learning from the dead. So this is what he says. A young monk came to Abba Macarius and said, "Abba, give me a word." And Abba Macarius said, "Young monk, go to the cemetery and abuse the dead." I mean, this is how all the stories of the Desert Fathers are. They're a little strange. These are crazy people. And the young monk is sort of aghast, but goes to the cemetery and, starts yelling mean things at the people buried there. "Curses upon you, you horrible, evil people who've been dead a long time. Yeah, you're all in pretty rotten shape now." And he goes back to Abba Macarius and says, I've done what you said. I've abused the dead. And Abba Macarius says, and what did they say to you? And the young monk looks at Abba Macarius and he says, "Nothing, they're dead." And Abba Macarius says, "Now go back to the cemetery and praise them." And the young monk says, "Oh no, more of the same." So he goes back to the cemetery. "Oh, you saints and righteous people, blessed are you. Such a wonderful example for all of us still struggling through this life." And he goes back to Abba Macarius, and Abba Macarius says, "Did you do it?" And he says, "Yes, I've praised them, Father." And what did they say to you? Said Abba Macarius. "Well, they're still dead." "Nothing," said the young monk. And Abba Macarius says to him, "And this is how you too must be. Like the dead, take no account of either the scorn or the praises of men." A word from the desert. Be like the dead. How much does it matter? Are you operating on a plane where the voices you are listening to are the right voices? Audience is important. Now, you might think that it's really tough to go cold turkey, as Abba Macarius recommends. It's really tough to take no account of any praise or any scorn of men. And obviously he's being a little hyperbolic here for the sake of rhetorical effect. And it was effective, wasn't it? But what do we do with respect to learning to be more dead to the praises and the scorn of others? Well, one of the practices recommended by this tradition for many, many hundreds of years is the practice of silence. And this is the practice of not talking, not Facebook posting, not telling other people about yourself and your wonderful life and all the things you care about and your emotions and priorities and your take on thing and your excuse for all the things that you did last week. Just silence. And what you realize in the practice of silence is that sometimes the silence is deafening when you stop talking. We sometimes don't realize how much of our talk is about the management and creation of our own image. Solitude is another practice, and this is an audience, an absence of audience practice. So pull away from other people, pull away from contexts and scenarios in which other people are watching you, in which they are thinking about you, in which they are evaluating you. Go to a place where you can be alone. What does it feel like to lay down an audience? Does it feel like laying down a burden? Does it feel like being able to be yourself? If so, silence can be good for you. You could remember who you are. when you're not always trying to be what other people want you to be. Now, I like to sort of tinker with these desert practices a bit and practice them with my students in class. So I'm going to describe to you an experiment that we did together. For a week, what we decided to do was not talk about ourselves. Right? So they had to leave class that day and come back a week later without self-talk. So you could talk about other things if you had to, raise your hand in class and things like that. But when it came to sort of talking about things that pertain to you, excuses, rationalizations, feelings, stories, comments, all that kind of stuff, I said, let's just try to shut that down for a week and see what happens. So we did. And it turned out to be really hard. First of all, because we kept forgetting to do it. You just wouldn't believe how hard it is to stop talking, right? So we would often catch ourselves halfway through a conversation in which we were sharing something really important about ourselves or our opinion about something, and we'd be, whoa, I'm supposed to be practicing silence. All right, so what we did is we used gum, or one kid even used an airsoft BB, kept it in his corner of his cheek to remind himself to be quiet, that was the practice, because he felt like otherwise he would keep blabbing on and forget to be quiet. And he's actually modeling that practice after Abba Agatha, who kept a pebble in his mouth for 3 years to remind himself to be silent. Well, I didn't ask them to do 3 years, and the pebble didn't really appeal to him, so he came up with his own creative appropriation. But once we remembered to be quiet, what was it like? It was kind of no twittering, no Facebook posting, no delicious long commentary on everything I think about everything. It was no snarky comments while we're watching TV. You'd be amazed at how much you do this when you watch movies and television. You do running commentary about what you think, about how dumb they are, right? We just shut all that stuff down. And what happened to my students is their friends would say to them after a day or two, are you feeling okay? Kind of quiet. Because we realized how strong our default mode was, right? So once we shut that down, what happened? So after about 3, 4, or 5 days, their friends kind of got used to them not talking. And guess what? Their friends started telling them things that there otherwise wouldn't have been room in the conversation for. Once you stop monopolizing the conversation with self-aggrandizing commentary about yourself, you'd be amazed what people will tell you. So what happened was that my students turned out to be not just practicing not talking, they were also practicing learning to listen. They were practicing attention giving rather than attention getting. They were practicing being good friends by being able to receive what others had to give. What does it look like when you lay down image management for a week? It looks like becoming a better friend. That was the space of a week, and we didn't even stop all talking. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? I mean, it was an exercise in imagining a different kind of community with a different set of practices and a different kind of formation at the heart of it all. Now, I think it's helpful to have some real examples of how this goes, and of course, there are sages in all sorts of unlikely places nowadays. And there's an interview done with The Edge, who's of course the U2's lead guitarist. And in this interview, The Edge actually talks about this dynamic of overcoming vainglory on the part of the band, and how they learned gradually to handle that fame and glory better. And you just don't get any more famous than these guys, right? So here's what he says. He says, after our Joshua Tree album, we were as famous as you could be in music. And frankly, it was kind of overpowering for a while. If anything, it was something we tried to downplay. I don't think we ever really wanted celebrity in and of itself, because we came out of the whole punk rock movement and was trying to sort of take the establishment down. So more than anything else, he said, fame was a kind of psychological torment for the band. Especially in the beginning. So he says, at the big U2 concerts, we were really just hanging on to try to make it through. There was an element of desperation in which we were just trying to stay focused on the music. And if we got seduced by fame, I think our version of it was that of being too self-conscious, taking ourselves a little too seriously, wondering whether we really lived up to all the hype. Were we a good enough band? Were we really able to deliver on our fans' expectations? So it's a kind of almost a fearful form of vainglory that comes with success. Apparently it took the band years to outgrow it, but here's how The Edge concludes the interview. He says, I think now that we're a little bit older, we just feel extremely fortunate to have such great fans and to have written some great songs. It just gets to the point where you say, look, this is me. I'm not everything I want to be yet as an artist, but that doesn't mean I don't have anything worth sharing. Now, without being complacent, we're really enjoying what we're doing. Do you see the progression from sort of getting so caught up with the attention that it was hard to even focus on the music to then shifting away toward loving what they do and being grateful to be able to share it with an appreciative audience? I want to talk a little bit more about audience considerations here. Again, going back to Augustine, and I'm sure all of you know that later in life, after his conversion, eventually he became Bishop of Hippo. And so where is he? Now he's not a worldly rhetorician seeking acclaim and applause in the arena of human praise. He's in church, but he's still up front. He's still an orator. He's preaching, right? So how is he going to think now about his vocation as a pastor of a church, as a bishop, when he's still in the limelight, when he's still getting glory? And one of the things that he says is, look, the focus here has to be on the gifts and the giver. So again, remembering that the end of glory is God and his glory, because the beginning of glory is God's gift of goodness. Where did the goodness come from? How did we get the goodness we have? Well, as he says, it's from the Lord's storerooms. If I'm standing up here in the pulpit preaching good stuff to you, it's because I have received good things from God. And my job is now to be a waiter, someone who shares, someone who brings food from the source I have found it in and shares it with others. He also, interestingly, confronts vainglory head on in a sermon he delivers quite late in his life on an anniversary of his bishopric in Hippo. So it's kind of an occasion of celebrating him as a wonderful pastor, right? And you can just see how all the occasion of vainglory just kind of rises to the fore here. So here's what he says in this sermon. What am I to do today but present you with a danger I stand in, so that you may be my joy? Here's my danger, that I pay attention to how you praise me and take no notice of the sort of lives you're leading. But God knows, and it is under his gaze that I speak, under whose gaze that I am not so much delighted by praise and popularity as I am vexed and troubled about what sort of lives are led by those who are doing the praising. As for being praised by people who live bad lives, I don't want that kind of praise. I shudder at it. I detest it. It causes me pain, not pleasure. While as for being praised by those who lead good lives, if I say I don't want it, I'm going to be lying. But if I say I do want it, I'm afraid I'll be more bent on vanity than on the solid good. So now what do I say? I don't completely want it, and I don't completely not want it. Isn't it interesting to hear Augustine as an old man still wrestling? I mean, there isn't sort of a super triumphalist narrative here. It's always the onion. I don't completely want it in case I should be imperiled by human praise. I don't completely not want it in case it should mean that those to whom I preach are ungrateful. So then, and here's, I think, the most interesting thought he raises here. So then, brothers and sisters, lighten my burden. Lighten it, please, and carry it with me by leading good lives. What's going on here? I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about what it would look like to create a culture of good glory. Obviously, you can see the way we can get a bad feedback loop here, where vice on the part of the audience, sort of sensationalist expectations, lead you to greater and greater forms of vainglorious either fakery or craziness in order to get attention. But what if we could twist that around and make it a virtuous circle, where Augustine preaches from the heart of the Word of God. He gives them the best goodness He has from God. And they're appreciative. And as a result, they live good lives. And their goodness and their is an encouragement to him as a preacher. And as an encouragement, he can rejoice in their goodness. They can rejoice in his goodness. And together they can become the kind of community that is a witness to God's goodness. Isn't there a virtuous circle here too? I'm really interested and intrigued by the thought that we could create a culture of good glory. What would it look like? What would it look like to do this well? What would it look like to be a community where we have genuine encouragement offered for genuine gifts, where we have celebration, where we have gratitude, where we have love and affirmation that is given face to face? What would it look like to be a culture of good glory? That's the question I want to leave with you tonight. One last story from the Desert Fathers, and then I'm done. Abba Lot went to see Abba Joseph and said to him, Abba, I fast a little, I pray a little, I meditate a little, I live in peace as far as I can, I purify my thoughts. What else can I do? It's kind of, okay, I practice silence, I practice solitude, I'm doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And the old man says, think big. The old man stood up and he stretched his hands toward heaven. His fingers became like 10 lamps of fire. And he said to him, if you will, you can become a living flame. And that, I believe, is what God calls us to with respect to glory. So let your light shine. Thank you.
Just outside here, in the atrium. I'm going to be on moderator and questions. I'll just get up to shut this down at the end, so you have time to mingle and ask questions out there afterwards.
Questions?
Come down to these mics so you get questions.
I will take questions, comments, and vehement objections. All are welcome.
So I'd be interested to hear your opinion on how much of it is idol worship when we're talking about the bands, because to a certain degree, like, they need to be getting themselves out there, they need to be known so that they can be, I mean, this is how they earn money, this is how they put bread on the table, but at the same time, their faces are getting plastered on posters that we're hanging up all over rooms, or everybody's dying to get their autographs and get their pictures taken with them, and that seems like a form of celebrity worship and idolatry to me. So just be interested to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, so the question is really about Christian artists, and especially music artists, I think, what you're thinking about, bands who need to sort of capitalize on public exposure in order to make a living, and yet the worry is that they get co-opted by that whole system. And I mean, I think this is a place where we need to be creative about new systems. And I think Christians are good at doing this kind of thing when we put our heads together, but we do need to be intentional about it. I remember a Christian rock concert I went to with my kids a couple years ago, and we paid $25 a ticket to get in. And then this artist got up on stage and wanted to do like a worship thing and had an altar call and everything, and was, you know, sort of, if you're not waving your hands in the air, you're not sort of enthusiastically participating in worship. And I thought, am I at a rock concert or am I at a worship service? Do I go to an altar call at a venue where I paid $25 to get in the door? There's something that just felt off about getting one set of practices sort of co-opted by a different set of institutional structures. And maybe what we need to do is think more intentionally about different social structures and different ways of showing affirmation. And this leads to a question that got raised earlier today about how we worship. Not just in rock concerts, Christian rock concerts, but in the sanctuary on Sunday morning. What does our worship look like? And in what ways are we forming ourselves counterculturally into a culture of good glory and gratitude and celebration? And which ways are we being co-opted and assimilated into a culture of sensationalism and praise and bad glory? I think that's a real problem. And sometimes what we need is one lone prophet to sort of get the ball rolling. And sometimes what we need to do is, I think, be faithful and have integrity, even if that costs us financially. I know that's not an easy answer, but I do think I've seen that. I think all of us see those choices in our career at some point or other, where look, you can either make it big by getting co-opted into a certain kind of system that could very well be corrupting, or you can be faithful in a small way. And you might have to sacrifice to do it. So I hear that struggle in their context, but I think it's actually a struggle all of us face to some degree. And I will say from my own experience that faithfulness is very hard sometimes. But I also encourage you young people to be creative about doing things differently. I see a lot of creative movements, grassroots kind of stuff on my own campus at Calvin College. And my guess is you Houghton folks have just the same sorts of great resources here to think outside the box. Just do it.
First, I want to say thank you for coming, but I'm real convicted to go delete Facebook and everything, but we have to be honest that even though, we come here and we talk really about let's stop talking, or like let's stop talking about ourselves, the world is still talking and always talking to us. And I guess my question is, in this society where, if we're all trying to create an identity because we're so individualistic, right? This is who I am, this is what I say, this is what I do. And when people are creating these identities, sometimes if the other individual is not affirming that identity, it's seen to be